So to embrace some of the points that Gary made, which is in fact very much part of almost all the sessions that we are having at this conference, and why we are here, and why we have just issued as an organization a major statement on diversity. We are having a conversation between two brilliant people. Each year, the AAMC, whose ideas have generated, has a keynote speaker whose ideas have generated new thinking and led the way to advancements in the curatorial profession, either directly or indirectly. This year's original keynote speaker has been so innovative that even before he spoke, he has led us to a new approach in keynote addresses, a conversation between two people, an enlarging of the discussion, and an inclusiveness that is the mark of his career. This conversation should be most interesting to us all. Before you applaud, I want to say a few words about our speakers. Darren Walker, 10th president of the Ford Foundation, and Hilton Als, a noted author and staff writer for The New Yorker. There is so much that could be said about both men. If you Google as much as I have, you know that I could bore you for the next 30 minutes without beginning to touch it. I'm going to try to avoid a listing of their many honors, which you can just find as easily as I did, and focus instead on their involvement in the arts in the areas that overlap with curatorial interest. In doing so, I must first acknowledge that we invited Mr. Walker and Mr. Als to speak because of their drive to consider patterns and usefully disrupt them to make the world more inclusive, less hierarchical, and less filled with inequities. Darren Walker, who is from Texas, and he says his mother lives here now, so we are welcoming him home, has written that he is a self-proclaimed, quote-unquote, arts person. As a student at the University of Texas, he planned art shows on campus. While with the Abyssinian Development Corporation in New York, he got Brooke Astor, a leading patroness of the arts, to invest in reviving parts of Harlem that had been built by the Astor family. The street of charming houses that she restored, Astor Row, ends in a historic house museum, the Morris Jamel Mansion. Mr. Walker began at the Ford Foundation as Vice President of Education, Creativity, and Free Expression programs. He may not even remember these titles. Surely any artist would love the last two phrases, if not the first. The curators would probably like the first for sure. President of the Ford Foundation since 2013, he led the organization into providing major funding for Detroit that ensured the survival of the Detroit Institute of Arts, where we recently had our annual meeting to offer the AAMC's own support to that institution. He's also on the board for the High Line, Art as Gardens, or Gardens as Art, and the New York City Ballet, Art as Dance, Performance Art to a Curator. Hilton Als is the son of New York, and who studied art history at Columbia University. He is an outstanding author who most recently won the 2016 Wyndham Campbell Literature Prize for nonfiction for his book, White Girls. In it, drawing in part from works published earlier in other forums and other sources, including the art magazine's Art Forum and the Studio magazine, Mr. Als explored boundaries of all types. He became a staff writer for The New Yorker in 1994, its theater critic in 2002, but he also does what is important to us, art criticism. And one review that I found most remarkable was his compelling assessment of Carol Walker's Sugar Babies. And most importantly, for an audience of curators, he is also a curator, an author for many exhibition catalogs on contemporary artists. Among his shows was the Robert Gober retrospective at MoMA in 2014, and most recently, a collaboration with the artist Celia Paul on Desdemona for Celia by Hilton, presented in the Lincoln Center's Gallery Met in 2015, a show which the reviews say were the first time that your photography was presented to the public. The conversation between Darren and Hilton, innovative rethinkers of boundaries, seekers of inclusiveness in the world, and most wonderfully for us, men who have spent time in different eras of their lives as what we are, curators, should be illuminating for us all. So without spending any more time talking about them, please join me in welcoming our curatorial colleagues, Darren Walker, 10th President of the Ford Foundation, and Hilton Als, curator, author, and staff writer for The New Yorker, to a conversation on the arts.
Yes, this is really a conversation between two friends, and so I'm already bossing Hilton around, that he should be in the middle.
He's curating me.
Thank you already. Thank you, Helen, that was lovely. And Gary, what a brilliant, I think your remarks were so profound, and I'm so grateful to be back home.
Yes.
I mean, Hilton and I were yesterday talking because Hilton had never been to Houston.
No. And Beyonce was my welcoming committee. I went.
Indeed. I love the fact that when I said, "Oh, Hilton, you have to come to Houston for this. It'll be great," and he said, "And I'll get to go to the Beyonce concert."
She was very pro Houston, and in the millions of people screaming and so on, she stood up suddenly with hair that was down to that podium, and said, "Houston, I'm from here." I spent 20 years in Houston, and the people went crazy. So I'm going crazy for Houston now too.
It's a really amazing city, and this museum, which for me is such a jewel,
Yeah.
and reflects the innovation of this city, and in some ways the contradiction. I mean, Houston is in so many ways, as Texas is, this place that is so high and so low on so many barometers of measures of all sorts of things. But this museum, I mean, when you think that they brought Mies van der Rohe to Houston to design this, when you think about the influence of patrons like Dominique de Menil and these remarkable patrons who have endowed, I mean, this museum. I mean, Gary, I think after the Met, it's got the largest endowment. After the Getty. Oh, even larger than the Met. Wow. Correction. Thank you, Gary. So, Hilton, we are going to, so the idea was, I detest, sort of giving speeches, which is what people ask you to do when you're the president of the Ford Foundation. And I'll do it when I need to do it, but I just thought it would be fun for us to talk about what we love. And so both of us love the arts.
Yeah.
We love all arts. I mean, we love culture, high, low, everywhere, everything. And you write so beautifully about culture in The New Yorker and those amazing catalog essays that you do.
Well, I think it was such a early lifesaver for both of us, right? That we grew up in what sociologists would call challenged circumstances, and one of the ways that we were not limited as human beings by economic and racial circumstances, and was to dream through art.
And how did you dream? So you were a young boy in Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm.
So how did the arts come into your life?
I had an extraordinary older sister who was very interested in painting and poetry, and so she would take me to free events in our neighborhood in Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights, and there was this is during the days of sort of pre-identity politics, and it was Black Nation time, and there was a place called the East, and it was a collective, a building that you could go to where there were jazz concerts and poetry readings and classes in Black heritage. And so that's where I discovered Frederick Douglass, but I have to say I was interested in Frederick Douglass for another reason other than his politics. I thought he was really handsome. And so so I had a photograph of him over my bed for a long time, and my mother said, "Oh, isn't it wonderful my son's interested in Black history?" And I was like, well, sort of, but
I'm interested in black men.
exactly. So it was this kind of lively convergence of art never being a dead thing for me, that it was always a living thing. And also, through my mother, I met an extraordinary man named Owen Dodson, who was a professor at Howard University and a theater director. And through him, as a teenager, I met people like Derek Wolcott and Toni Morrison, who had been a student, and all of these people who would come to see him. And so the liveliness of society and the historicism of people who had created converged in my mind, and I realized that I was very interested in art history eventually, because it really sort of encapsulated everything that I was interested in, which is society, politics, aesthetics, sociology, anthropology. It was just the field that was, to me, the most exciting thing once I discovered it. And I discovered it by accident. I didn't know anything that it existed, except I took a course at the New School for Social Research when I was 19 in Chinese art. And Professor Chang, whom I thank to this day, said, you're a very good art historian, you should study. And that's how I went to Columbia.
So I think, as you know, for me, my introduction was through these wonderful art books and shelter magazines that I would get from my grandmother, who worked for a family here in Houston. And I used to love to get these magazines and books that would come in brown paper bags that she would pack for me. And I would see in those books and on those pages lives and lifestyles and people who were so completely foreign to me and my own experience. And yet, I was able to, in so many ways, broaden my imagination by looking at things that were so completely different. I mean, so it's the first time I saw Warhol. It was the first time I saw people and artifacts that were so, for a kid out in a small town in Texas, so far removed, and yet it made me imagine things. It made me, it was escapism in some ways.
Escapism, but I also think that this can't be underestimated, I don't think, or shouldn't be underestimated in the curatorial world, where there's a soul connection, right? We always forget that our souls respond to something as deeply as our eyes do. We don't know why we're drawn to Warhol when we're 12, or why Kelly Walker speaks to young black artists, but we understand that it's essentially a not verbal response at first, and it is a connection to something that is powerful and that speaks not only of what the artist is saying, but what the artist is saying about us.
But what's interesting to me is you turned out not to be trained as a curator because there were barriers.
Well, Darren, you are such a good reporter. I am recommending you to David Remnick immediately. It was when I went to Columbia in 1981. It was still an all-boys school, and largely white.
White all-boys.
And I had no idea when I showed up that was the demographic. I had the great good fortune of studying with two incredibly brilliant people right away, and that's Kenneth E. Silver at the New York Institute. Please send your children to him, and Molly Nesbitt, who's at Vassar. And I wrote, speaking of Warhol, I wrote my first big piece on Ethel Skull 36 Times, which I had never seen except in books. And Ken called me into his office and said, you might think about writing because you'll have more freedom outside of the academy. The academy was such a thing then that it was not too far-fetched to remember that great American authors like Elizabeth Hardwick stopped graduate school because they could not teach because they were women. So it was not far-fetched of Ken to suggest that I find, and he meant it with love, it was not deterring me. To have a career at that point meant that I would have to do things like go to Europe. I would have to find the money to go to Europe, or I would have to study something that was a real big blocking point for me, which was connoisseurship.
Why was that a blocking point?
Because it seemed very defined by politics to me, that when I really thought about it, that it was as much the study of something as it was the study of the life that went along with it. So I couldn't be a connoisseur because I couldn't take those trips to be with the artworks and to understand the society that they had grown out of. So I wasn't stymied in that. He was giving me an alternative, which was, you can do this. You can self-educate and educate with our help, but you can have more freedom if you're writing.
And in some ways, he was acknowledging the sort of reinforcing privilege of the sort of curatorial zeitgeist, that we've got this gestalt of privilege that just reinforces itself. And so a poor, a poor black kid from Flatbush isn't going to be going to Europe.
He knew that there were no means, and in fact, he's going to die if I tell you this, but I'm going to tell you anyway. He's the reason I got to Paris. He gave me $500. And he and his lover picked me up at the airport, and they found me a place to stay, and that was my first trip to Europe. He gave me $500.
So in some ways, he was your patron.
Yes.
So what did you think when you hear what Gary just, I think,
I was very moved
challenged this audience? I think there were many messages that were, I think, that are quite profound and quite disruptive to, I think, the normative kind of ecosystem in this country of museum leadership, museum operations, and the very idea of this notion that there are stairs, and at the top of the stairs stands this curator, and you're invited up the stairs, and the curator will bestow their brilliant knowledge on you. I mean, that's a very sort of 19th, 20th century idea of the role of the curator. But what do you think?
I think that this is a very interesting question. I think curatorial practice has gotten deeper and wider than when I was in school. I find that I'm drawn to those curators who do the legwork still, who don't just wait for someone else to acknowledge an artist, but go out and find the artists that really are reflective of the times, or a past that reflects on the present. The curators that have always mattered to me were, in the best sense of the word, social creatures who were able to go out there and do essentially what reporters do, which is to find the story.
But don't you think that I read recently someone saying, why do we have this new sort of world of artists and curators who are obsessed with politics and race and these things that really don't have a central role in art?
I see what you're saying.
And aren't we, in some ways, advancing this sort of identity politics in this country at a time when we need to understand our commonality and our common humanity?
Well, you can't get balance without tipping the scales, right? That the one way that the scales get to be balanced is if you tip it in a direction that might be considered quote unquote excessive in some way. I don't think that the fashion for identity politics matters to me very much. In fact, it generally irritates me. But I feel that and I understand that it's necessary in order to balance the scales, because it's been many, many hundreds of years of the other thing. I can't tell you, I cannot remember studying Black American art at Columbia. I don't think that there was such a thing. There was no such thing as, I think there was an oceanic arts class, but mostly it was Europe and America. So I get tipping the balance to find a balance, and there will be a balance eventually when there are other things to look at.
But isn't it also true that art and representation has always been about politics and gender? It's just that
There's
politics,
more language for it now.
and that it's been broadened. I mean, but when you look at those Gainsboroughs, I mean, it's all about hierarchy and class and classism and who is advantaged and who's disadvantaged.
Right.
When I look back, I see the issues that critics often I think challenge us today. Identity politics. I mean, I see identity politics represented in Sargent.
Right.
I mean, I see identity politics represented in Rome. I mean, so is it a fair critique?
I think that I don't think any critique is fair, because it's always about ideology or trying to convince somebody of something. But I agree with you that when I looked at Millet's photographs of women gathering, hey, it was not too far away from what I understood about my own mother's life. That's what I meant earlier about the soul connection that tends to get lost through language about art, that it speaks to us in ways that not only broaden us, but also I think should challenge in some way. The things that we're drawn to as viewers don't necessarily literally speak to who we are. They don't represent who we are. They are speaking through metaphor. And that's, again, something that's lost in this discussion, is there's a storytelling, mythic, imaginative, hugely imaginative element to art making that the soul is drawn to, and I think gets kind of clouded by language, or the language of what is appropriate or not appropriate. I think we're losing that connection.
But when I look back on some of the things you've done, and I think about the controversy you have stirred on occasion, much of it is about the intersection of race and class and sexual orientation. I mean, that you've taken these things on frontally. I mean, the black male exhibit at the Whitney was a highly contested affair.
Yeah.
I think there were it was a very divisive, some would say, exhibition, because Thelma so lifted up a point of view about black men in America. And so why are these things so contested today?
I think, well, first of all, I have to acknowledge someone in the audience who was instrumental in that, and that was the director of the Whitney at the time, who is now your colleague here, who was a great man. And I was the editor of the catalog, and I was controversial in that I made art historians and curators go back and rewrite. That was huge. And to make the language more specific about what Thelma was trying to do in the show. He is an incredible person, and as in my life, this has happened a number of times where curators have stepped in and given me something that I needed to make something happen. So thank you, Warren. Thank you, Jay Saunders. Thank you, all these marvelous people who know that art is connected to the way that we live. and that how people live. So that's one thing. Secondly, I feel that the Black Male show in particular was Thelma's very, very strong reaction to not only the artists that she was seeing at that time, but her own relationship to Black maleness. And that was, again, the autobiographical element that can affect curatorial practice really well. I felt during that time that I didn't have the language to talk about it as much, which is why I was very grateful to edit the catalog and to discover things. I feel that it's taken me many years to come back to, from the Black nationalism I grew up with, to the kind of humanism and feminism that I'm interested in now. Not that all things are created equal, that we know that that's not true, but all things are entitled to being seen. And then you make up your mind about what you prefer or not, or don't prefer.
But today, I would imagine a lot of the curators in this audience struggle with these issues as well. Because I think one of the real challenges is something that is a theme of this meeting, and that is diversity within the ranks, among the staffs, the curatorial staffs. So let's talk about this issue, because I think it's a very challenging issue that speaks to pipeline and professional development, and how many art history students are in undergraduate who are prepared to go on to graduate school. Do you have to go to graduate school? Right. The issues, I think, of the sense of kind of insider status that exists, or at least is perceived about the sort of the curatorial ranks at many museums. How connoisseurship today manifests at a lot of museums, where you have patrons who are increasingly empowered because more and more private support is needed. And so more power is then invested in those individuals who can underwrite shows and who make the large gifts, who are trustees. And there's a risk there. That risk has always existed. But today, I think that risk is even greater because of the diminution of public support and the greater reliance on private support. And there's a real risk there for museums.
And do you think that, this is something that I don't know about, but I've only experienced one-on-one, the fact that there are many interesting curatorial programs pre-doc, I guess, curatorial programs. The thing that I've noticed when I meet kids from them is that they don't read outside the field.
What do you mean?
They're reading works by other art historians, curators. They're not reading Flaubert. They're not reading Peter Handke. They're not reading Chinua Achebe. They're not reading literature that says as much about the time as that critic or curator has described. So I would vote for a greater diversity of reading.
So that the curriculum should change.
Yes, you have to start there, because if the kids don't understand the context, their focus is only going to get narrower and narrower. And so, of course, they're going to approach something with a grave sense of responsibility about identity politics, because that's what they know, but they don't know Van Gogh's letters about suffering and isolation. So to broaden the spectrum of thought seems to me essential.
Well, I think when I think back to the Jacob Lawrence show at MoMA last year, it was the larger context. I mean, I had a conversation with Leah and Glenn when the show was being conceived, and I gave them feedback. I said, what I read is Jacob Lawrence, happy black man. Jacob Lawrence was not a happy black man. No. Jacob Lawrence was a really angry black man who had been terrorized in the American South and was forced to leave. And his paintings, if you actually engage, and you engage in the context within which he executed those paintings,
Yes.
you've got to understand that to understand the paintings.
Yes.
And I think it was the first time I saw a show with Jacob Lawrence with all of the media that gave context to the 1920s and 30s and 40s in America when he did those the migration series. And it was such a more, I think the reason it was such a powerful show was because she was able to get outside of the normative kind of curatorial treatment of Jacob Lawrence.
And express anxiety, right? I think one of the things that we're taught as good curators is to disjunction gets lost because we all want to do a good job by the artist, but there are moments of discord and disjunctiveness that I think should be allowed in. But again, this goes back to the issue of the ideological taking precedence over the soul connection or understanding of something that is not a verbal medium. And I implore everyone, including myself, to not lose that connection and to allow for imperfections in one's own work, just as the artist has to allow for imperfections in their work. I think when you have those cracks and chasms, you're getting a whole other narrative that's amazing. I think, for instance, one of the great shows that I saw recently was Kathy Hallbright's, my God. Oh, thank you. Polka show, because it allowed for the corners not meeting at all, for the fact that he was working in so many different medium and also was very dismissive of the idea of connoisseurship. And that was one of the great shows in New York that I saw recently, where those disjunctions were allowed for and those silences and those cracks in an artist's facade. So I think that that was, to me, an amazing model of getting past what the language describes and allowing the artist to be imperfect and allowing the curation to be imperfect too.
So speaking of ideology, do you think it's ideological? I think there's a lot of debate about what a museum should be. I mean, this again comes to what Gary was challenging us. I mean, I once read a New York Times quote by a museum director who shall go unnamed, who offered a great
they're in trouble.
Offered a great critique of the Brooklyn Museum, because the Brooklyn Museum had dancing, had these dance parties. And Arnold had, as you know, opened the museum up to these Friday night dance parties. And they were very community oriented. They still are. I mean, it's a huge tradition, and it absolutely was a different vibe at those events than one might be used to. But I thought it was very interesting because the same museum director, as I pointed out to him, I had danced in his museum, but I was just in black tie and most of the guests were white. And it was a dance party. It was a dance party. We were in black tie. It was the Temple of Dinder. We were dancing. It wasn't in Brooklyn, where there were mostly African American, mostly younger, and Brooklyn. And I thought that the fact that a museum director could criticize another museum director in the media for opening up the museum in that way reflects the kind of ideological, I think, chasms that, in order to meet Gary's challenge to us, we're going to have to bridge.
Yeah, got a little too jiggy for that, curator. Yeah. I agree with you utterly. I have nothing to add to what you and Gary were saying, because it's the truth.
So I think we're going to open this up because we wanted to be a conversation with you as well. So we'll keep talking.
Tired of me.
This is what happens when you're friends and you can like smack him on the head when he says things like that. You stop it. Do we have mics, or shall we just have people ask questions? Oh, we do have mics. So yes, ma'am, you'll go first, and tell us your name and your institution, and then ask your question.
My name is Marjorie King, and I'm with the American Federation of Arts. I actually, speaking of the Brooklyn Museum, I wanted to know both of your reactions to the recent protests that happened in Brooklyn.
So the protest that you are referring to is a protest that emerged as a result of the museum leasing out galleries to a real estate firm for an event. It was covered extensively in the media in New York. And I think in some ways, the museum is not to be blamed here. As I said earlier, there is growing pressure, and you all know this better than we do, on museums to generate earned revenue, as it is called. And some museums have become truly desperate because the NEA grant is down, the local grant is down, the State Arts Council grant. I mean, every public source is decreasing while expenses are increasing. So where's that money going to come from? Museums are run by smart and creative people, and they will find a way to generate additional revenue. And in the case of Brooklyn, the museum has an extensive marketing program of the museum to the private sector. So law firms and real estate firms and bar mitzvahs and whatever, if you can pay, you can have a gallery in the museum. And it absolutely is controversial, but it is a common practice, at least in New York, and I think in other cities as well. Yeah. I think this is in some ways a manifestation of the growing inequality that we have in our society, where public support for the arts is going down. The museum's operating costs, particularly museums like Brooklyn, or most museums that have had any expansion, because as you all know, the moment you expand, your operating costs go up. Yes. And so that's what we saw. And the arts community in particular protested. And I am of two minds of it. I mean, I would love for museums not to have to do that, but I understand why they have to do it.
That's brilliant, Darren. No, seriously, I mean it.
Follow up
Please.
Thing on that. I'm really interested to hear your reaction to that in general, but also I was thinking about what just happened. I think it may have been yesterday, actually, where there was an occupation of certain galleries at the museum. Yeah.
I didn't hear about the occupation.
Yeah.
I've been away. So there was an occupation, please.
I mean, I can,
Just briefly, the occupation was in response to this same issue or a different issue?
In response to this issue, but it took on a more general, it was initially spurred on by
Yes.
what you're talking about, but then took on a more general, more general topics or different related topics.
Well, I mean, I think it's what you're seeing in some ways is the larger public who are consumers of and who visit our museums, and who also are stakeholders in our larger culture, feeling that things are being compromised in the pursuit of money, and that I mean, I think we see it in our politics, that people feel that we are being corrupted by commerce and commercialism, and our mercantile economy has so overtaken the underpinnings of our democracy. I mean, Michael Sandel at Harvard has written a lot about the skyboxification of America, where everything now is up for sale. And if you are, I mean, I learned recently one of my goddaughters was going to Disneyland, and at her private school, they all know that you get the Gold Pass at Disneyland. So actually, you don't have to wait in those long lines. So a generation ago, no matter whether you were rich or poor or whatever, if you were in a line at Disneyland, you sat in that line with your kids in the summer heat, and well, today, if you're rich, there's a different line at Disneyland. And I think it's the whole idea that our culture is being corrupted in a way. Next question. Next question. Yes, right here, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Marianne LaMonica, and I work at Bard Graduate Center, and I'm from Brooklyn.
Oh, good.
So I just wanted to ask, I think you raised a really important question about the pathway to our career, and those who know me here, I've always said that the diversity question also is so embedded in the economics. And I remember when I told my mom, a New York City school teacher, that I wanted to be a curator, she said, "That's for rich people."
Yes.
And I said, "I understand, but it's really what my passion is, and it's what I want to do." And I've been very fortunate to have a career
Yes.
for almost 30 years. So my question is, when do you think, I mean, both of you in New York, and this sort of pathway in mentoring people into the career, I mean, must we do more in elementary schools to take kids to the museum? Must we do more in real professionalized programs in high schools? I mean, where do you think people would benefit from intervention?
I benefited greatly from a number of programs that came through my school, one of which involved the performing arts, and they would have dancers or actors come in for 2 days to put on a production. And at that time, there was such a thing as a school newspaper that was mimeographed. And so my first experience of writing was talking to performers who were coming through, and that was another indication of, oh wait, they leave and they go out into the world somewhere else. Their story continues. So I think I benefited greatly from after-school programs that probably don't exist anymore, and also from the idea that your teacher was someone that didn't at 3 o'clock say goodbye, that she or he would start a newspaper so that the kids could write and then stand there and mimeograph and Xerox and give them out for free. So it's this idea of community doesn't stop at 3 o'clock or begin at 9 o'clock. It's a continuum. And that's what I think got lost with the business of education and public funding.
And I think that this question of pipeline is one that a number of institutions, including yours, including AAMD, including a number of foundations, my own, patrons like Alice Walton and Agnes Gund, Buffy, I mean, I just hear it's sort of in the water now. The question is, can we really execute on this? And I think there are biases in the system that simply have to be taken on. I, for example, had a museum director say, well, but there's just so few African American PhDs, and we just can't find, et cetera. And I said, well, you know, I know a really great one who just got turned down for a postdoc at your museum. That's impossible. How could that have, you know, and I said, actually,
It is possible.
It is very possible, and you know, I'll point you to them. I mean, if you, and so it is, there was a bias in the process, and so I think part of it for museums is that if we really want to change, we have to interrogate our practices, the kind of systems that we have in place, because we need to embrace a larger world, a larger community. And that's going to require change.
And you know that from your own experience, right, of being a woman during that time, not of means. How sort of sometimes how awkward it would be in conversation with colleagues or students, and they would say, "Oh, I'm going to," and you had to work, or you couldn't go to see, you know, to Florence for 6 months and soak up, you know, Florence. So. There's just this kind of great discrepancy between what is allowed and what's encouraged. And I think that if in universities there was more encouragement, but this goes back to the economic issue of, grants, for instance, that are available, or particular ways in which people who are studying or love art history and curatorial studies are encouraged to apply in many different ways to get the funding that they need to study. So, for instance, that's why I'm such a maniac about kids reading outside of the field, so that they can apply for other things. They can apply as literature students or as writers. There has to be a broadening outside of that field. I got stuck, which was bad. I didn't know of things outside of that until Ken Silver said, there's this. You would have greater freedom if you did this.
Yes, so we have questions down front, and then in the very back, there's a question too. Yes, so yes, ma'am, here.
Hi, I'm Jen Mergel. I'm at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I'm also leading a panel tomorrow morning on the pipeline into the field for internships. And it alarmed me that last Tuesday, there was reported in Los Angeles a suit being brought against the Getty by a young woman who was alleging that the Getty was discriminating against her because they wouldn't take her as an applicant for an internship designated for students who were from historically underrepresented minorities. And so I'm grappling with how all of us can think about, as you said so eloquently, Hilton, you have to tip the scales to balance them, how it is in 2016 we live in a litigious society in the US, you deal with a young white woman coming to the Getty and bringing suit against them for
Right.
trying to do exactly what we're talking about.
It's like one of my favorite, Charlotte Rampling. I do adore her on screen, but it was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard when she said that, the diversity issue about the Oscars was unfair to white actors. And, wow. I don't know what to say. But I think what Darren has been expressing so beautifully is there are real nuts and bolts issues that have to take place and that have to happen in order for the craziness to be not minimized, but to be sort of integrated much less dramatically into the conversation.
And I think what you are seeing is part of a national movement by conservative legal institutes that have been set up in part to challenge policies like the Getty's policy, and we have been on the receiving end of that as well. And I think what we must do, and what this in some ways reflects, is the contestation of race in America and our continued unwillingness to reconcile our history with today. And I think it is simply, to my mind, absurd that a person would assert discrimination in that example, given the history. But it is an inability to reconcile that history, which is what leads to the kinds of actions that we are seeing across all of. So, for example, we receive the same kinds of letters because we have programs at the foundation that have sought to redress, for example, the lack of PhDs in the professoriate who are of African American, Latino, Native American backgrounds, and that we have received that same letter, and yet the fact that it is indeed a fact that the reason we have so few today is a function of our history, and we are attempting to redress it, and in redressing it, that we would be accused of discrimination. That is what happens. And my view, our view at the foundation, is that we have to take that on, that we can't shirk our responsibility to demand that we address and reconcile the issue. And it is highly contested. It's not for those who, if you're not really committed to this, if you're not really committed to redressing it, you'll just shirk and say, sorry, we didn't really mean it. We really didn't mean that we meant to diversify the curatorial ranks, if it means that we're going to have to actually stand up and stand for something.
And risk embarrassment.
And risk embarrassment, and risk the cost, et cetera. In the back, yes, ma'am.
Hey, my name is, this conversation is so encouraging for me on various levels. One, because I'm a graduate student. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts Amherst who is living this life that we're
And what is your
talking about.
name at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst?
My name is Kelly Morgan.
Hi, Kelly.
It's an honor to talk to you because I'm a recent Ford dissertation fellow.
Yay! Another one of our great programs that I'm so proud of, the Dissertation Fellowship Program. And it just finds these amazingly talented young people doing great work.
How do I get that?
Okay. I'm a former curatorial fellow of African American art at the Birmingham Museum of Art. And Birmingham was this wonderful, like really encouraging, supportive space. And so when my fellowship ended, I left, and now I'm just finishing my dissertation. But I've interviewed for several diversity fellowships and been denied, and it's been, oh, you're overqualified, you know, or I'm in these interviews speaking to curators or speaking to museum directors about how I can sort of come in and sort of engage or activate, you know, because I'm reading these strategic plans. There are collections of African American art, and their eyes are like as big as saucers, you know, when I'm asking, like, how can I get works by African American or African artists of African descent, like, into your modern rotation? You know, why is Hale Woodruff or Romare Bearden not in the gallery with Duchamps, right?
That's
or
because they're
Picasso?
taking. That's because they're listening to you personally and as a judgment, as opposed to what you can actually teach and instruct. They're listening to you feeling judged before you even say anything.
Yeah, and that was my question. Like, how do I, like, moving forward, like, I was so disenchanted even about coming this weekend because I've been so kind of dejected. And then yesterday was great, like, getting the type of advice that I've gotten from people I've met. But it's like, how do I navigate this world?
And I think it's really a great
too.
point. And I think this is the challenge often for in the professional trajectory for all of us. And I think, I mean, here I sit, you know, we're sitting looking at the most successful curators in America. And I think if we were to do your oral history, you would say that there was someone who came into your life at some critical point in graduate school, when you had your postdoc or whatever it was you were working on, as you just described with Silver.
And Silver, yeah.
Who, and often for women, for people of color, those experiences don't happen. And particularly, I think, for people of color, and I think particularly for women of color, those experiences, they may happen, but they may not be as potent. The person may not be as powerful and as connected as Ken Silver. So sure, it may be a great mentor, but they don't have the connections to call Tom Campbell or Glenn Lowry or Michael Govan or Gary Tinterow.
Yes.
And get you in front of them.
That's it, yeah.
And I think that's one of the real challenges.
It's not you're coming at it. You're defenseless, and you need defending. And so what that means is that person who looks at you the way that Darren looks at you and says, okay, I'm going to call so-and-so. Cast your mind back to those people who loved you and who said, you can do this, and you write to those people and you call them and you say, this is so hard, how do I do this? They then will make that call for you. Ken wasn't, just to be clear, Ken wasn't attached to museums. What he was attached to was a way for me to become a writer, to circumnavigate all of that stuff. If that's not what you want to do, you cast your mind back. Truly, in your hotel, you lie down and you cast your mind back to the people who loved you. There will be one person there who can help you navigate this, because you're coming at it defenselessly, and most people that you're meeting with feel judged and therefore defended against you. I think that's the practical help that I can offer you.
Yes. We have time for a couple more questions. We have down here at the front, Elizabeth, I think, and then that gentleman there too. Yeah.
Rita Freed, also Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and also a Ford Foundation Fellowship recipient, for which I am very grateful.
Yay!
We're all concerned with making art relevant. And I'm hearing a lot about working with living artists and bringing them in from the community and having their art relate to us. What do you do about the dead artists? And I'm talking, in my case, the long dead artists, like 3,000-year-old dead artists who I haven't had the chance to speak with. And it is a real concern how to make ancient art relevant in today's societies. I'd be curious to hear what you have to say about that.
I think my approach would be to juxtapose it with something from contemporary or relatively contemporary world with the work that you're doing. I think shows that I liked as a kid that don't get much done, that post poor William Rubin's Primitivism show, that sort of got shut down, where people were doing shows that contrasted the past and the present, or Africa and Europe and so on. But there are ways to do it that I think are very enlivening and sensitive to your subject matter, but also to the contemporary world. So I would maybe try to do little shows like that that give people an entree into that world through stuff that they may recognize and see the connections. That's one way.
Yes, over here. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Blake Ruine. I'm an independent curator in New York City. And Mr. Als, you mentioned something that Mr. Walker you were describing something, and you said our souls respond to something as deeply as our eyes do.
Mm-hmm.
But the soul connection tends to get lost.
I'm excited.
It's beautiful. I think that should be printed in the New Yorker.
Yeah.
And it's something that
email address.
Well, I responded to it as well, because that's what, as a curator, I'm trying to facilitate that connection for people, whether they're art world veterans or whether they have an aversion to it, and I'm trying to help them find the place for art in their lives.
But you're doing, I mean, you guys, all of you guys are totally intimidating great people, because you guys are really translators. You know, you're working between two worlds and using language in your field to describe things that don't necessarily make sense to the world, and you're making sense of things for many, many people to be enriched by. That's a huge responsibility and also kind of great honor. And so I think instead of feeling beleaguered by the chore, let's consider it a sort of act of grace in a way. I think it will lend a lot more energy to what we're trying to do in terms of translating or explaining or showing the world people that we love.
Yeah, and I think the potential for that is there for anybody. And I'd love to hear if you have ideas that come to mind on ways to make that happen, or ideas that you've seen work to bridge that gap.
I think that's a lunch, actually.
Lunch with Hilton.
Lunch.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Tracy Glabb. I'm from the Flint Institute of Arts. Grew up in Detroit, Michigan.
Yay, Detroit. Yay, Flint.
The actual city, not a suburb. Anyway, it's my pet peeve when people say they're from Detroit and they actually grew up in Grosse Pointe. Anyway, so my question, and I have a comment too. Well, first I'll comment. Something that just builds on what was said earlier. I think that the academic whole part needs to be brought into this because I have a master's degree from Wayne State University and I'm working full-time as a curator, and I looked into PhD programs and none of them will, at least in my area, offer part-time PhD programs. I'd have to quit my job and my source of income in order to get a PhD, which I just think is ridiculous. And I understand why they do it. They're trying to train more academics to go and be professors. But to me, if you're already working in the field, why wouldn't you? Anyway, that's my comment, pet peeve. But my question for you, and I really love this idea that you brought up about the diversity of reading. I was wondering if you guys want to chip in on or weigh in on what would be your essential text or reading for a curator, or more than one.
That's a really good question. It probably wouldn't. I think I would recommend books that were that encouraged seeing in some way, but weren't necessarily related to art history, but the history was there. So three things that come to mind immediately are Madame Bovary, Elizabeth Hardwick's Sleepless Nights, and Billie Holiday's autobiography, Lady Sings the Blues.
Next question. Great. In the very back, we've got the last question. Yes, ma'am. Please tell us your name and your institution.
Hi, I'm Rachel Cook. I'm a curator at Diverse Works here in Houston. Hilton, I was wondering, I had the pleasure of seeing your exhibition at the Artists Institute recently, and I was wondering if you could talk about now the artwork, the visual work, as well as I read a little bit of the text that you produced with Jenny, and that experience of coming back and working with the Artists Institute.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a great experience because I had stopped making these installations many years ago because I'd gotten so discouraged by I hate making these generalizations, but I had gotten very discouraged by what I saw happening to other people in the art world. And the artists that I chose and make these installations around were people who were pretty much guileless about the art world. They were students, in fact, that I had met doing crits at Yale and others in Columbia. So I felt so rejuvenated by this kind of new hope that I see in young artists who are, they're sort of they're not so entrenched in the idea of a career so much as they're really in love with making things. And their enthusiasm brought me back to that place or that person that I had been who loved to make things and put things together. And I feel so fortunate to have this run at the Artists Institute to show the world really, or people who are interested in coming by the galleries at least, what is interesting to me aesthetically and also emotionally about this soul connection that I was talking about. I responded to the artists, and as I said to Jenny when she approached me about the project, I said my art is other people, and so that's what feels great about this, and they've inspired me to make things again.
So final question, Hilton. Are you hopeful about the arts?
Yes.
What and why?
Because I know you. I mean that. I mean that. And I mean that seriously. Because I know people like you and people like Jay Sanders and extraordinary people who open their doors.
Well, I think it's one of the things that you and I talk about a lot, and that is, as two African American men in very prominent, high-profile roles, we have a lot of privilege. Yes. And I think one of the things that we talk about is how do we use our privilege to advance some of these causes and issues? So yeah, we've got to pick up the phone and probably make more calls than our peers might, but it's also because we know that we stand on the shoulders of a lot of people who made it possible for two black gay men to be sitting at the kind of top of our fields. Yeah. And it's important that we think about.
And I think also a very important aspect, and this is one reason I love you, is because there's no self-consciousness about it. It's just what you do. And I think that when people become aware of their position, there's a lot more that they want to protect and be self-protective about. But when you are walking through this atmosphere and feel lucky to help other people, that's the bottom line, and that's the thing that keeps it real and beautiful.
Well, we feel very lucky to be here in Houston, Texas with all of you today. Thank you very, very much.
So thank you to Helen and Gary and Darren and Hilton for what was an amazing morning, or at least I thought was an amazing morning. We're going to take a little bit of a break and ask you all to come back at 11. The galleries are open. You can stretch your legs for a bit, and then we'll come back for our first panel. Thank you so much.
Your colleague Allison Green has asked me to remind you to have a look at our William Kentridge on view in Cullinan Hall.